Hi, this is Rachel again with Elite's Literary Book Group, and today I'm going to go over another Q3 question. But I want to when I offer the courses, just keep in mind that the only way it's going to work is if you actually, read the book. And I know there's a lot of Spark notes and Snoop doggy dog notes and things like that, but they're only going to get you so far. So here's another example. Okay, so 2003, according to critic Northrop Frye, tragic heroes are so much the highest points in their human landscape that they seem inevitable conductors of the power about them. Great trees are more likely to be struck by lightning than a clump of grass. Conductors may, of course, be instruments, as well as victims of the divisive lightning. Select a novel or play in which a tragic figure functions as an instrument of suffering of others. Then write an essay in which you explain how the suffering brought upon others by that figure contributes to the tragic vision of the work as a whole. This is my favorite topic. I love tragedies. Probably the most. And I think the reason I like them so much is because I can identify with flawed people and I find them much more interesting. We'll talk about that when we get to A Doll's House, because I want to do a question about, starting with a Q3 question about ambiguous characters and, what makes them ambiguous, partly is because they're not perfect people. We don't write about perfect people. I mean, that should give you some, encouragement if you're trying to be a perfectionist. That it's much better to be just flawed and interesting, and you won't drive yourself crazy trying to please everybody. So, anyways, you'll learn a lot from me. Okay, so all right. So tragic heroes first. You notice the great tree that gets struck by lightning first. In order for it to have a great impact on not just that person, but the people around them, the people who are suffering, they have to actually be considered a great person. And we've seen a lot of men in particular fall this last few years with the Me Too movement. People like Bill Cosby and even actors like Kevin Spacey. And it's disappointing because for me, I grew up in the 80s and I watched the Cosby Show, and I always saw him as a father figure type, and you still want to hold on to that belief. You really do. And it's not that you should judge people based on like their worst moments in their life, because if God marked iniquity, who could stand? But if you're considered a great person, everyone's looking up to you, and you've had this talent and this ability beyond everybody else, it seems worse somehow when you make a mistake. And so what's also kind of ironic about it, though, is you're also very likely to make a mistake, because as you've been given this power or fame, you start to believe that you're not like everybody else, and maybe the rules just don't apply to you. And I think this is kind of what happened to Nixon. I'm just going to read this part really quick. When I need some light reading, I like to look at William F. Buckley's obituaries. And he talks about Nixon, and he starts off by quoting someone who said, public figures come to be associated with one single achievement, never mind how complex the career. It says, and true, we can say that about Lincoln with the Civil War, Edison harnessed electricity, FDR as he created the New Deal. But what achievement will Richard Nixon be associated with a generation from now? And of course we know it's Watergate. And so it doesn't matter how great of a politician Nixon was, everyone's going to remember him for that. And it's sort of like Bill Clinton, which I think is even more tragic, that he's going to be remembered for Monica Lewinsky. And it keeps going. So um, if I was looking at this question, and I give you, sometimes I think they give you a quote just in case you're not really sure about what a tragic figure is. Just like last time we looked at coming of age, and they said, the moral and psychological development, they are trying to help you figure that question out, because you have to write about that just as much as you have to write about your example. So I think the best example of tragedy is King Lear, and a lot of you probably haven't read it because you would be reading it your senior year. So hopefully you're reading it this year, and if you want to read it and want me to put a course together for it, which I'm still trying to figure out and do, I'd be happy to do it. Since I'm trying to get through this video quickly, there'll be kind of a lot of spoilers with the play, though, if you're wanting to do that. So, okay. The reason why King Lear, I always bring up King Lear, because I think it's a couple of things King Lear says that I think really encompasses the tragic hero. One is, he says, "I'm a man more sinned against than sinning." Yes, he is flawed. But the other part of a tragic definition that we have from Aristotle is that there's also something in the universe that is against you, and he also says the gods are against me. And so this is pre-Christian, primitive play. So when King Lear prays the gods, he's praying to like Apollo and stuff. But that fate, if you remember Romeo and Juliet, when Romeo kills Tybalt, he says, "I'm fortune's fool." And it was the idea that the wheel of fortune, and they even mention it in King Lear, that there's this, Edmund says, like, turn again, and, the stars now smile. I'm getting this wrong, but something about now smile, the gods smile for bastards or something like that. But anyways, there's also the fate, and we know that that's true in Romeo and Juliet because of the miscommunication, the letter that didn't get there. She dies, he thinks she's dead when she's not, then he kills himself and she wakes up. Part of that's just a lot of bad luck as well. So they have that against them. There's something in the stars, which probably is what made them great in the first place, is also going to make them have to suffer. King Lear, I like using King Lear because not only is he a king, but he's an old king. And with the tragic flaw, and a lot of people would probably disagree with this, because a lot of people would say the tragic flaw is hubris, and that's fine, because it is. If you look at any of the flaws that we have, I think it all comes back to pride. And even something like gluttony, or you're indulging, or you're slothful, you're lazy. Laziness is actually a sin. It comes from the idea that I deserve this, I need this. I deserve to drink a bottle of wine after teaching all day. Sounds reasonable. But anyways, it comes back to a pride issue. But in my case, if I was trying to write a paper, I would much rather use Vanity for King Lear, just because I think there's nothing more sad than an old person who is still vain. And King Lear, in the beginning, he asks for his daughters to flatter him, and depending on what they say, that's how much of the kingdom that he's going to give them. So the two oldest sisters have no problem with this. They're like, "I love you more than anything in the world," and he's pleased with them. And then the youngest daughter says, "Nothing." He said, "Oh, nothing comes from nothing. Speak again." "Nothing. Nothing." And she explains later, I love you according to my bond. And I would use this as we're thinking about a theme of, go back to that chart, and I'll show you the chart again. Okay, so we have the prompt, which tragic heroes, definitely, we have to talk about that. Now, I want to get to the suffering of others, but I need a literary element. And anytime I would, be asked to talk about tragedy, I would have to talk about the tragic flaw. So we're going to use the tragic flaw kind of as an instrument that causes suffering to others. And in this case, King Lear's vanity. And then at the end, I need to come up with where is all this headed? And the reason why I stopped here is because nothing is significant throughout the entire play. It all comes down to nothing. Our existence. Man is nothing. And King Lear has to find this out. Someone who is robed and, honored and is even asking for something very superficial like flattery. That's not who he is. And he has to be stripped away from all of it to have some kind of understanding of truth. And that bond that the daughter who refuses to flatter him, that bond is more powerful than any of the, accolades the other sisters, because they don't really mean, the words don't mean anything. It's the duty, it's the loyalty. That's the love that she has for her father. And of course she suffers for it because he kind of exiles her. He leaves her without a dowry. And so the other people who also suffer the most is Kent, who's the Duke, and the Fool. And what's interesting about the Fool is they actually make a pretty good character foils, because you always in a play want to look at character foils, and the Fool is actually the wise one. And he says to King Lear that I'd have you whipped for being old before your time. And he says, what do you mean by that? And he says, you cannot become old until you've become wise. You just gave your daughters the control. It would be the same thing as an older parent saying, all right, I'm going to go ahead and give you your inheritance early and you do what you want with me. And they decide, oh, well, we're going to take the house, and she's kind of a pain. We'll stick her in a nursing home. But that person already made that decision. And so he gives the girls the control, and they abuse it. Meanwhile, the one who really loves him and cares about him is now off with her friend. So in the meantime, Cordelia can't help him because he's exiled her. And I just want to read this one part when she says, "Nothing, my lord, nothing, nothing. Nothing will come out of nothing. Speak again. Unhappy that I am, that I cannot heave my heart into my mouth. I love your majesty according to my bond, no more or less." And so he basically accuses her of being prideful, and in the meantime, he also, his other closest friend, probably Kent, who's the most loyal to him, gets on to him and says, Kent unmannerly when Lear is mad. What wouldst you do, old man? Thinkest thou duty shall have dread to speak when power of flattery bows? To plainness honor's bound when majesty stoops to folly. Reverse thy doom. And this is the reversal that ends up happening, that's also a characteristic of tragedy, is the king has to go from king to nothing. And some people would say that this is an example of nihilism. There's a subplot where Edgar is also falsely accused by his brother, and same deal, the older father didn't believe, or just jumped to conclusions way too quickly, and he ends up trusting the one he can't trust, and not trusting the one who's actually loyal to him. So and just a side note, it's not until he loses his eyes that he's able to see the truth. And that's a common characteristic of an archetype of the blind, that they're blind, but they end up seeing. And so what Lear, when he meets this Edgar who's been falsely accused, and Edgar goes out to the wilderness and he becomes what I would say is kind of like this John the Baptist figure. He just messes up his hair, and he's puts this stuff on his face, and he looks just like, he takes off all his clothes, and he's out in the wilderness. And that's, I think it's kind of not nihilism, but like asceticism as a way of stripping down everything. Like monks that practice asceticism, they're very strict about fasting, for instance, about anything that it's the opposite of satisfying the human passion. So anything that's comfortable or whatever, you take that away. And so when Lear is kicked out by his daughters and it's raining and storming and everything, and he sees this guy and he sees, look at this man, nothing but like this worm, and he gets this epiphany and he says, I got to speak to this philosopher, this guy right here that stripped everything away from him and is just kind of laying in the dirt. He knows, he understands, and King Lear takes off his clothes, and that's the reversal. He takes off his robes. He's done with that, and when he does that, he's able to actually get closer to the truth. So what I want to get to at the end of my discussion is, if I'm going to do King Lear, I got to talk about the idea of being nothing, because I think it's such a contrast to, especially when your tragic flaw is vanity. And it's not until you strip yourself away from all that vanity that you actually find your truth. But because of that vanity, everyone has to suffer. Even the fool suffers. And so we'll look at my claim. Okay, King Lear's tragic flaw, vanity, blinds him of the loyalty of those who love him most, causing them to suffer as they watch their great and worthy king stripped down to nothing. I have a lot of scratches where I wrote this, like when I try to do. So as you should too. So when you're trying to write this and you're trying to get it down, just try to get it down first, and then take the sentence and rewrite the sentence. But again, this is the most important sentence, because now I'm going to address the suffering of others, but I didn't want to say just about the suffering of others, because there's that idea that it has to represent like the entire tragic vision of the play. And so I really want to get to the reversals, and I could even, in my examples, mention the fool as his character foil, and the reason, what I'm going to try to get to is they're suffering because they're loyal to him. If they weren't so loyal to him, they probably wouldn't suffer as much. But all of them are willing to die for him. Okay, so next time I will go through, assuming that you've read A Doll's House, and I'm going to use a Q3 question kind of as our guide, but I'm going to go Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, make 3 videos. All right, thanks.